But before I begin, is there a young woman here by the name of Serena Roncia? Serena gave me a letter as I was leaving this morning. I read it you're quite a writer, and you have a very, very clear way of organizing things. I'm quite impressed. And what I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, and we can use a pen name or some way to conceal your identity, because I can guarantee you that these people you're talking about are very vindictive. But I'd like your permission to circulate to a few people your letter. I was very, very impressed with it. So, if it's okay with you, this says, I give permission for John Taylor Gatto to quote from my letter to him unaltered, in part or whole. If I request, he will conceal my identity for my protection. This young lady is a teacher, and did you write that here?
No.
Wow, that's.
As I was reading the book.
You need to write a book yourself, because. Oh, okay. I need to speak up louder. Thank you very much. So, the talk this morning is almost ready, the one you heard. I've been working on that one for 35 days, and I'd say another week or so, and the parts will move together. The real temptation when you're talking about complicated issues is to cheat your audience. I must tell you, the temptation is to simplify things, make them a cartoon, and then everybody nods their head because they seem to understand. It's just a week later when you get home, you say, what did he say? And it makes no sense. So I really struggle to put all the moving pieces in, because these issues they're subtle. The parts that play against one another aren't cartoons. And if you're going to deal with them accurately, I'll give you an example. What you see on an organization chart about the power in Australian schools, I guarantee you, I've never seen your organization chart, I guarantee you it is almost totally inaccurate. Nobody who works for the school system on any level, including whatever you call the top name, has any power at all. They're all satellites of wherever the power is located. I would imagine in Australia, it's certainly with the mining interests, perhaps with sheep, cane toads. I mean, well, I've not ever seen a cane toad, but and that's true anywhere in the world. The people who are hired to represent themselves as the creators of what the U.S. system, the Australian system, are not. They're all fronts, every last one of them. And they know that. Now, if you know that, here's what you can do. If I knew in New York City, and I do, who actually calls the shots in New York schools, and I'm a lowly classroom teacher, and I want to do something that's absolutely forbidden, I don't waste my time talking to anyone on the school pyramid. I make a contact with somebody in the real power structure and I say, I can make this worth your while because there's going to be a lot of favorable publicity if we pull this off, and I don't need that kind of attention. So as far as I'm concerned, this project, if it works, is your idea. Let me tell you how often that approach succeeds. It always succeeds. And now a phone call is made and the order goes out. Just ignore whatever Gatto is doing. And I'm ignored even if they despise me. That's what I mean about complexity. So this weapons of mass instruction manual tonight, the ideas are all here, but in order to make them clear, to get clarity in this thing, just requires rewrite after rewrite until finally you see that the pieces are balanced. For example, I read this over. This is the one I finished at 5 in the morning, and I'm doing what musicians call vamping till ready. I don't know if that expression's in Australia, but it means that I'm taking a deep breath because there's an imbalance in this piece. What I set out to do in the piece, besides touch precise bases, tools that hurt your children and hurt you in your day, I tried to provide a rational reason why this is done. The last thing we want to do is to look at this as some vast evil conspiracy. The truth is it's quite evil, but it doesn't regard itself as evil at all. It regards you as dumb, irrational, dangerous, etc., etc. That's why these things are done. But there's a more important reason they're done. And I'm going to try to ad-lib this reason, because when I get to the section I wrote here, it makes me blink. It certainly needs rewritten. There's a concept, there are two concepts, but one in particular you have to understand why so much talent is wasted in schooling, why people who normally would have bright ideas and initiative are dumbed down and disconnected from their own power. It would seem to be suicidal for a country to do that. So I'm going to tell you about a disease that occurs in capitalism called overproduction, which is the worst nightmare for the people who run capitalist economies. Now, overproduction was a term used for hundreds of years until too many people like me figured it out. So if you read the financial press, what I'm about to explain to you is not referred to any longer as overproduction. It's called overcapacity, but it's much clearer if we call it by its original name. Here's the problem. Actually producing things, not working at a job, but producing things isn't very hard. And technology has made it pathetically simple for anybody to produce almost anything. What happens when too many people produce? Well, you can figure it out. We're flooded with goods, and the price of the goods collapses. And the money that was borrowed to tool up to produce these goods by the big corporations is lost, and then they can't borrow money for their next productive enterprise. That's pretty clear, isn't it? there was in your part of the world throughout the 1990s a tremendous economic crisis caused by the fact that Japan, which had huge trade balances, figured out a way to invest those balances that caused a nightmare of overproduction over here. What Japan figured out was that there weren't very many places to invest these trillions of dollars it had, but what if they broke that money up into little packages, 1,000 here, 5,000 there, and they loaned it to a rickshaw driver, for example, so that he could get a second rickshaw. They loaned the money to housewives so they could open little part-time grocery stores in their homes, etc., etc., etc. And for a little while, they were just swimming in profit from doing this, plus people felt good about them. All of a sudden, now figure this out. If you have a village of 500 people, how many rickshaws can it absorb? Because once somebody sees that, that Bob has now got 2 rickshaws, they want to borrow money too. And Japan had it to loan. Now the village has 3 rickshaws, then 5 rickshaws, then 15 rickshaws, and 40 grocery stores. So overproduction, although it wasn't humorous for the people whose economies collapsed over here, but overproduction has been around since the beginning of capitalism. So people in charge of things made defenses against it. And the best defense is in your mind, where you don't think of yourself as a producer, but you're going to work for a producer. If you excuse yourself from taking over economic command of your life, that's all to the good of the management of capitalist societies. But at the point when you begin to compete, you only need examine the early years in the computer business, where there were huge catastrophes all the time. Generations would change, in a few months there, because too many people were producing. The way that was stopped, maybe you already know this, the way it was stopped in the United States is for the U.S. government to issue gigantic profitable contracts to a few people, not because they made better stuff, but simply because they would then use this financial advantage to put their competitors out of business. The U.S. military is a favored relay of those kinds of subsidies. Anyway, so overproduction. So the rational reason, not the power reason, but the rational economic reason for dumbing you down in school and almost never allowing you to apply what you've been told you learned, so it's just so many words or hot air. The reason is to prevent overproduction. The second big idea you have to understand is something called hyper-democracy. That's a term invented by the Council on Foreign Relations about 30 years ago. And the idea is that modern society is way too complicated to actually allow democracy to work. It can work in inconsequential ways, in popularity contests, for example, but never on important decisions. The most recent example of that is so flagrant that I'm stunned that everybody didn't realize what was going on. When Mr. Bush decided to attack a nation that hadn't attacked him first, he said he was organizing a coalition of the willing. And in that coalition, the first partner was Great Britain, which had voted in public opinion polls 88% against joining the coalition of the willing. And that was the best result of the partners in this war, 88% against. Spain was 97% against, and Spain joined the coalition of the willing. What kind of democracy precisely is that? I'll tell you, it's George Orwell's Newspeak from 1984. And if the young people in this audience haven't read that book, you've got to read it. It's only 100 pages or so long. Orwell was on the inside of the people who planned the society we're living in, on the inside. And he's not talking about the Soviet Union. He's talking about Great Britain as an oppressive mind control state 40 years ago. Imagine, with the sophistication of modern technology, how much farther that's gone. So hyper-democracy, the only country that actually responded democratically to the will of its people, was France. France was 95% against the war, and France didn't go. So the United States punished France by cutting imports in half and lots of other nasty ways. So school is intended rationally to redefine the word democracy to mean that your mind should be occupied with popularity contests, never with serious decisions. Those are for insiders to make. And you should never, never think of yourself as a producer of your life. You're a consumer. And if you're a nice consumer, you can get a good job. Someone will pay you. But the idea of you paying yourself, well, okay, so now I've ad-libbed about half. But if you know those two concepts, then you can see why these otherwise crazy weapons of mass instruction were actually devised, put into place. Because otherwise it just seems like it's insane, which of course it is. Since the middle of the 20th century, let's pick 1950, the economy has been made so simplified, so specialized, so algorithm-driven. Algorithm's a term you want in the front of your mind. It's constantly used by the insider tech crowd. It's simply a recipe for doing things. So you hear algorithm, you say, what's the recipe? What are the parts? What are the sequences? So it's become so algorithm-driven, the economy runs by formulae, that educated people with independent minds and active moral natures are dangerous to its health, and so are productive people. This is vitally important for you to know, because you haven't a prayer of understanding how schooling hurts your kids without understanding first that schools must exist either as a friend of things exactly as they are, or as a danger to that settled order. And if you're a danger to the settled order through your schooling or through your classroom teacher, count on the fact that there are eyes and ears everywhere to pick up deviation and to get rid of it. Those are the poles between which the school pendulum all over the world always swings. And because of that, the school equation is always primarily political, always. The only exceptions to that might be in little country towns that nobody cares about. We have trouble seeing this because we've been taught since early childhood to conflate schooling with education. And it's true, there's a little overlay of education on top of the political aspect. But your compass goes haywire when you fail to see that schooling must always be locked in a dance with the economy. In our case, in the United States, with the corporate economy. I imagine there's a different mix here, but I know that extraction, the mining industries are huge here, and that you, in fact, operate your sheep farms as extractive industries because the vegetation doesn't grow back in a normal way. It's much more slow to recover here, and your trees hardly recover at all because the soil is so thin. So a whole lot of the operation of the Australian economy is mining of one sort or another. Schooling is the servant of things as they are, the best police, a conservative force, and your attitude to change will determine your position on schooling. Thus, while managers traditionally sing the praises of education, and I know that if I read your big daily newspapers, they'd be jammed with the urgency to improve education, but that's not what they mean. They mean schooling. They are always actually on guard against the educated or the principled, because those people have a habit of arguing. And if that unfortunate tendency to argue is coupled with the knowledge of how to argue effectively, then it's a nightmare for the political management. So how do we stop you from learning how to argue effectively? It's just as easy as 2 and 2 making 4. Instead of building the curriculum of schooling from kindergarten all the way through high school around the most important of the 3 literacies, which is not reading, it's speech, talking to all different kinds of people, being able to deduce, you know, what arrangement of an argument will work best. You can't learn that from books. You can learn the theory of it. You have to practice constantly. And as the last time I looked, speech is the least of the activities in schooling, the least of the activities. The second powerful, used to be a term for speech and writing, they were called the active literacies because they're the key to recruiting allies. So you're not just locked up in your head, maybe your reading has converted your consciousness, but you're trapped inside your head unless you can recruit allies. And you do that through speech and through writing. So all we have to do is pull the plug on those 2 things. Of course, schools go further than that. They pull the plug on serious reading too. But if you just saw to it that most people couldn't speak or write except to people just like themselves, you have effectively rendered your population useless to themselves or victims of whatever you want for them. So, if you look at things from this perspective, all that's required of subordinates, people down the chain of command, is that they get with the program. And if they can't get with the program, that they don't rock the boat. Seen this way, efficient management is the perfection of subordination, and it's the highest goal in an imperfect world. What school's role is in this management ideal is everything. It sets up the conditions for efficient management by depriving you of the ability to resist management. There are lots of ways other than not letting you learn how to speak and write, too. If your head's full of incorrect information, let me give you a piece of it that everyone in the world's head's full of. You can't pass through secondary schooling, high school, without learning how, in this great democracy, a lot of countries fit that, how laws get passed. And there'll be stages, 1, 2, 3, 4. In the United States, it's called how a bill becomes a law. But you actually only have to live in the real world and use your eyes and ears to realize that no bill ever became a law the way the book teaches it did. If that's all you know is to memorize those stages, you have no idea how to get your will written into law there. So there are lots of ways to make you ineffective. The contradictions of schooling, and there are many more than I can possibly discuss tonight, but all the contradictions are related to making management efficient. If you look at school from the perspective of individual growth, it's a personal surrender of possibility, not the addition of new possibilities. It's the surrender of possibilities. 4-year-old Richard Branson knew that when he walked miles through London by himself to get back home. That was an enhancement of possibility. How could you ever be afraid of doing anything again? I once had an upper-class British couple inform me that the way they got rid of worthless children was